Welcome to the Northway Podcast, the first long-form, deep-dive history podcast that focuses exclusively on the Viking Age. My name is Henry Holst, and in this short introductory episode, we are going to get into the history for a bit to give you all a little taste of what this podcast is like. And at the end, we'll segue into an explanation of what this podcast is, as in how I'm structuring and creating it, and a bit about who I am and what my value add is here and why the show will be worth listening to. So that said, strap in and welcome to the Norse world of Midgard. Like many of you, I remember the day that 9/11 happened like it was yesterday. I was in 5th grade and in school, and I remember my teacher sharing the news with the class with a horrified look on her face. My dad being a pilot at the time, my mom quickly pulled me out of school to reassure me that everything was okay. And while I didn't appreciate the magnitude of what had happened, I could still see how it affected everyone around me. How shaken up and scared everybody was. In my memory, the event is far from unique. Almost every millennial and above can picture in their minds exactly where they were and who they were with and what they were doing when they got the news. Because things were never quite the same afterwards. It wasn't until I got older that I realized why. 9/11 had completely shattered Americans' sense of national invulnerability, which had grown during the decade of uncontested U.S. global military dominance that had followed the end of the Cold War. And people often forget the degree to which the United States was invulnerable for the decade leading up to 9/11, because we had obliterated the Iraqi army in the first Gulf War with basically no casualties, an outcome nobody beforehand had thought would be so overwhelmingly one-sided. And then Clinton was in office and the economy was growing. Our power was so supreme that one of the most popular books at this time among DC policymakers was called The End of History by Francis Fukuyama. And this book asserted that Western-style liberal democracy had won, in the sense that humanity had finally arrived at a supposed endpoint in its ideological evolution. Think about how successful and invulnerable Americans felt for a book like this to become the popular read in DC. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that the 90s were a time when life was good and felt a lot simpler than it does now. Obviously, terrorist attacks still happened, but they were small and infrequent and happened in faraway places against military targets, so they weren't something that the average everyday American could relate to on a personal level. But 9/11 robbed Americans of this feeling of invulnerability. And older listeners will recall how airports grew quiet, or instead of watching the news and talking casually with friends and family, travelers were now alert, and they were carefully scrutinizing everyone who was lining up to get on board with them. And while the societal reaction was one of understandable fear, sometimes it bordered on the absolute ridiculous. For example, when I was a kid, I thought it was entirely normal for the news to let everyone know what the color-coded terror threat level of the day was. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? For an average American family in Ohio, where I was born, sitting there in their bathrobes on the couch, sipping a cup of discount Folgers from the drip coffee machine, as the cable news muppets told them whether the terror threat level that day was orange or yellow? But if that sounds like a crazy overreaction, you have to remember that this was the first time Americans had been hit big at home since Pearl Harbor. These days we have the benefit of hindsight. We know that no major 9/11 style attacks happened in the US afterwards, but Americans didn't know that at the time. The reason 9/11 was so disturbing to the American psyche was because the attack had come by surprise. And it was done by people the average American knew nothing about, using a novel method that nobody had foreseen, hitting a civilian target using planes that normal everyday people used all the time and could relate to. And we start the story of the Viking Age with this because it is by a surprise attack that, in many respects, is similar to 9/11 that the official narrative of the Viking Age typically begins. And that day was over 1,200 years ago, on June 8th in the year 793, at a Christian monastery situated on a small island called Lindisfarne, which is about a mile off the coast of Northumbria in northern England, where, just like 9/11, a people who thought themselves secure were taken by surprise by an unexpected people from an unexpected direction, using a novel method that nobody had foreseen, hitting a target that held huge meaning to people living in England at the time. And just like 9/11 did to us, the raid on Lindisfarne shattered these people's sense of security. Like us, their world was never the same, but unlike us, they would face follow-on attacks and even invasions for generations. This was the new world that Western Christian Europe was awakened to on June 8th, 793. And just like with 9/11, this attack also started on a peaceful morning. Life at the monastery at Lindisfarne on the morning of June 8th, 793 likely began like any other since its founding 150 years earlier, with the monks focused on prayer and study of the scripture and work per the rules laid down by the Northumbrian saint and former bishop of Lindisfarne, St. Cuthbert. And while work in the decades after the monastery's founding in the prior century would have focused on evangelizing the word of God with the local pagan peoples called Angles, hence Anglo-Saxons and later Angleland or England, the Angles had been converted almost a century earlier. And with this primary objective complete, the Lindisfarne monks pivoted the focus of their work from evangelizing the good word of God to the making of books, which in a monastic context made Lindisfarne into something called a scriptorium, which is a kind of monastic bookmaking factory. So, sometime in the morning of June 8th, 793, probably following breakfast and prayers, many of the monks at Lindisfarne would have begun this work, standing in long rows behind elevated desks, manually copying out the Bible and other Latin and Greek texts one page at a time, painting elaborate designs on the margins of the pages, and studying the book covers with precious stones, work so painstakingly tedious that it slowly ruined the monks' eyesight over time, but it resulted in books so beautiful that later during the Middle Ages many would come to believe they had been made by angels. And if you're a visual person like me that likes to look at things as well as just listen to them, I've uploaded several images of this, and it's going to be worth pausing if you can and checking out, because it truly is that impressive. Easiest way to do this is to pull up my Twitter profile. My username is the Northwaypod, no spaces, in a post in the highlights section with this episode title, as well as my profile on podbean.com. That's Podbean, as in Podbean. And both of these can be found by Googling the Northway Podcast, no spaces, and Podbean. And all of this will be free to access. And it'll be worth pulling up if you can, as full-length episodes will be full of image references that are helpful to our story. But if you listen while driving, don't worry. I'll describe the important uploads like maps and whatnot so you can follow along regardless. But to get back to our story here, this peaceful way of life would be completely shattered on June 8th, 793. As recorded in the history that the Saxon kings of the South English Kingdom of Wessex wrote about their own dynasties, called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I quote from the Dorothy Whitelock translation. I quote, "In this year dire portents appeared over Northumbria and sorely frightened the people. There were exceptional flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine immediately followed these signs, and a little after that in the same year, on the 8th of June, the ravages of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter." End quote. 3 ships of warriors that are believed to have come from the region in southwestern Norway we call Rogaland today had shown up out of the blue, specifically targeting Lindisfarne and attacking it without warning, sacking it, seizing its wealth, killing many of its monks and priests, and carrying others off to be sold into slavery. And while it might seem strange to compare something seemingly small like Lindisfarne to 9/11, you have to keep in mind that this raid was a thunderbolt to the spine of the Christian world, just like 9/11 was for us. Because while 9/11 had surprise and devastation, the World Trade Center and Pentagon don't hold particularly profound cultural or religious or ideological significance in the average American mind. But for the Anglo Saxons, Lindisfarne did have these things, and it had them in spades. In very real terms, this raid shook them to the core because of the immense cultural and religious meaning that Lindisfarne had in the Anglo Saxon mind in a way that it might be hard for us to relate to. I love how historian John Haywood describes this in his book on the Viking Age called Northmen. He talks about how, in the minds of the now Christian Anglo Saxons, Lindisfarne was a place of immense holy power by virtue of the holy relics that it possessed. Relics in the form of the preserved bodies of the former bishops of Lindisfarne, who, after dying, were declared saints by the Pope, something that imbued their remains with holy power. And this is what made Lindisfarne into the second most important monastery in Britain. And keep in mind, this holy divine power was real to people at the time in a way that it isn't for many of us today. And you have to understand, these people didn't just choose to believe in this holy power. They knew of this power in the same way that you and I know that the sky is blue. Because belief that God actively influenced things on earth was a fundamental part of their concept of how the world worked. So these people didn't just believe that Lindisfarne's monks could channel this holy power through prayer, they knew they could. So you wouldn't be too far off to see these relics as a kind of telephone to God that Lindisfarne's monks presided over. And this entire situation gave these monks an immense amount of leverage over the Anglo-Saxons. And for example, the Anglo-Saxon lords of Britain gave rich gifts to the monastery to try and leverage its holy power in order to gain some measure of control over the important things going on in their own lives. And if that seems strange to you, consider how much relief and peace you would get if you knew that all you had to do was toss a few silver coins onto the plate and you get instantly granted some measure of control over life's uncertainties. You know, that job you really want, or maybe a sick family member that you're really worried about, or hey, maybe you're trying to launch a Viking Age history podcast, and all you need to do is toss a few coins onto the offering plate, and the monks pick up their divine telephone and start telling God that you really need a favor. I totally get it. But it's a funny thing to conceptualize, isn't it? The Pope declaring a dead person a saint and thus giving the monks a heavenly telephone to use as leverage with the locals. And this is how Lindisfarne got rich. Its monks wore silk vestments, a fabric that could only be obtained by being carried across the 4,000 miles of the Silk Road from China to Europe, and the monastery's interior would have glittered with gold and silver-adorned relics and candlesticks and crosses, and an immense wealth in coins would have been kept there from generations' worth of offerings. And what's interesting about this whole situation is that this wealth wasn't guarded by anybody. As the monks got up on June 8th and went about their day, quietly transcribing various books of the Bible, surrounded by this unbelievable amount of wealth, there were no armed sentries at the gate or watchmen patrolling tall stone walls, because there wasn't any need for any of that. Rather, because of the belief in Lindisfarne and other monasteries' holy power, these places had a kind of divine force field or energy shield from science fiction surrounding them that deterred would-be thieves and aggressors by the threat of God's divine retribution alone. And I love how John Haywood explains this. I quote, "Americans may trust in God, but they do not make him responsible for the defense policy. Early medieval Christians did. Belief in the power of the saints to intercede with God to protect their holy places was absolute. All over Europe, monasteries were completely undefended, and certainly no Christian would have dared risk divine retribution by violating them." End quote. Folks, if anything shows the depth of meaning that Lindisfarne held in people's minds, it's the fact that generational levels of wealth sat unguarded there for decade after decade after decade. And maybe I'm a cynic, but I can't imagine this being possible anywhere today. And beyond the shock of the raid and its impact on Anglo-Saxon spiritual confidence, the raid was also 9/11 on steroids for another less commonly appreciated reason. That it hit one of the most important centers of learning and spirituality in the Anglo-Saxon world. In my mind, I picture these places like little candles of knowledge and literacy and book production set amidst a kind of vast academic darkness in the region at the time. And the Anglo Saxons didn't have a lot of these candles, and the Scandinavians had just seriously crippled one of them. Another way to think about this is to try and picture a world where there's some kind of massive solar flare that wipes out the grid, and just imagine that, the society that stands up out of the ashes of this disaster centuries later has like 5 working computers that have saved copies of Wikipedia on them, and that to keep this flame of knowledge alive, that society creates a small group of elite specialists whose job it is to copy out Wikipedia by hand, because that's kind of how this is. And now imagine how you would feel if a barbarian raid had shown up and killed half of one of these groups. Because remember, these monks weren't just making copies of the Bible, they were also copying and preserving Latin and Greek texts from authors that many of you are familiar with and may have read, like Plato and Aristotle's philosophies and Cicero's speeches, poetry from Virgil and Ovid, histories from Tacitus and Livy, as well as Roman law codes and Roman theological literature, among a whole host of other things. So not only was this the major center of learning, but it was surrounded by an almost entirely illiterate world, where even the most powerful and rich men in Europe at the time, like Charlemagne and his nobles, who were contemporaries of the raid, were entirely ignorant of the written language and were dependent on clergy trained at places like Lindisfarne to read and write every letter that they sent and received, and to maintain every record that they kept. And then imagine how regular people, even further removed from this world of books, may have viewed this place of immense holy power, purposely designed to give a sense of awe, full of men who make beautiful copies of a book that tells the story of your God. And we go into this detail because it's easy to look at Lindisfarne and just see a building full of robed monks with some books and seizable wealth. But when you walk in the shoes of the Anglo-Saxons for a bit, you can begin to see why Lindisfarne was 9/11 on steroids. And because the clergy were this society's literate class and wrote things down, we can still hear the stunned reaction that the pagans were able to pierce God's spiritual energy shield. I'm going to quote a translated letter from a Northumbrian deacon and scholar named Alcuin, which is worth quoting not only because Alcuin was Northumbrian and grew up near Lindisfarne, but because at the time of the raid he was a teacher and advisor to Charlemagne at his court on the continent. And for those that don't know, not only was Charlemagne the most powerful ruler in Europe at this time, but at the time of the raid he was in the 21st year of what would become a period of 32 years of wars he would fight with pagans in northern Germany, or the people called the Saxons, as in the Saxons who didn't take over Britain after the Roman Empire fell in the late 400s AD, who didn't convert to Christianity, something we'll get into in the next episode. And these Saxons were very close cultural cousins of the Vikings, speaking a mutually intelligible language, worshipping gods that, in practical purposes, were the same as the Norse gods, just with a few small regional differences, and living in similar social structures as the Scandinavians. And so Alcuin, as a teacher and advisor to the Christian king who had spent 32 years of his 46-year reign subjugating and forcibly converting the pagan peoples on his northern border, is interesting to listen to. Because Alcuin would have been familiar with the northern pagan world that these raiders came from. They wouldn't have been strangers to him, quite the opposite. For the simple reason that the subjugation of the Saxons, who, again, lived on the doorstep of Scandinavia and northern Germany, took 3 decades of relentless campaigning by Charlemagne to achieve. And so his letters give us a flavor of what was being said at this court and how they reacted to their great enemy pulling off this raid. So here is Alcuin writing to the Northumbrian king after the raid. I quote, "We and our fathers have lived in this fair land for nearly 350 years, and never before has such an atrocity been seen in Britain as we have now suffered at the hands of a pagan people. Such an attack was not thought possible. The Church of St. Cuthbert is splattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all of its furnishings, and exposed to the plundering of pagans. A place more sacred than any in Britain. Who is not afraid at this?" End quote. Do you hear the shaken spiritual confidence? And the anxiety of someone who not only just lost people he likely knew very well, but someone recoiling in horror at the discovery that attacks against Christian holy places as far removed from the Saxon wars as Lindisfarne and his homeland of Northumbria are very much possible? Now, it should be called out that there was some initial sporadic Viking activity going on in England before Lindisfarne was sacked, and academics believe this because by reading between the lines of records at the time, it's clear that some things were happening. But you can tell by this letter that Lindisfarne was still hugely surprising. That, obviously, this raid hadn't been anticipated. Otherwise, why else were the monks and their great wealth just sitting there on an undefended island? But Alcuin quickly moved from what psychologists today would call the shock stage of processing grief to the denial and rage stage of processing grief, as he began blasting out hate mail to anyone connected to Lindisfarne who might have pissed off God, thereby motivating God to let the pagans through the energy shield as punishment. For example, he sent a letter accusing the bishop of Lindisfarne, who had survived, of having caused the raid because he had been involved in a scandal a few years prior by burying a murder on holy ground. He also sent a letter blaming the Lindisfarne monks, accusing them of poor discipline and neglecting their duty to the poor, of their eating too well and drinking too much and living too comfortably in their rich clothing, heavily suggesting that it was their fault that Jesus let the pagans through the energy shield. And then he got more aggressive and blasted out an angry letter blaming everybody, the Northumbrian king and the clergy, for the raid, because they had let the Northumbrian people's morality slip. And heads up, before I read the quote that I'm about to read, the translation here is a bit old-timey, so bear with me. But I quote, "Consider carefully, brothers, and examine diligently, lest perchance this unaccustomed and unheard of evil," he's referring to the raid here, "was merited by some unheard of evil practice. I do not say that formerly there were no sins of fornication among the people, but from the days of King Ethelwald's fornications," that is, the prior Northumbrian king, "adulteries and incest have poured across the land, so that these sins have been committed without shame and even against the handmaids dedicated to God. What may I say about greed, robbery, and violent judgments?" End quote. Isn't it amazing to peer into the mind of a medieval clergyman undergoing what, again, modern psychologists might call the denial and rage stages of processing grief? To be able to look into the mind of a man trying to square the raid's success with his medieval and Christian understanding of how the world works. Because to Alcuin, even though he would have known of other monasteries that had been sacked and burned during Charlemagne's wars with the Saxons, we know from his letters that he saw those instances and the Lindisfarne raid as punishment from God. In other words, God's energy shield was still absolutely effective. That wasn't the problem. It was that God had let the raid happen because Lindisfarne's monks, Northumbria's king, and the people were all horrible sinners. These letters Alcuin wrote are the real reason we are starting with the Lindisfarne Raid. Not because the raid is the conventional starting point to the Viking Age, which it is, but because when I read through Alcuin's hate mail and saw him searching for an explanation for why the raid happened, I realized that, more than likely, that most of you had the same question that he was grasping for, of why did the raid in the subsequent Viking Age happen? Because the Viking Age wasn't some historical inevitability, where we add some wealth over here and give some boats to the guys over there, then boom, you have a Viking Age. It's so much more complex than that. So Alcuin's letters put a fork in the road for me, because I realized that if we take the conventional approach to the Viking Age and go straight from Lindisfarne into the raids and conquests and exploration that define this time period, without first exploring why the Viking Age happened, a question that has everything to do with who the Scandinavians are and the nature of their belief systems and societal organization, way of life, and what was going on in Europe at the time, that I would be making a mistake. Because without building a strong foundation first, our story would inevitably become one told from 30,000 feet looking down, where we stay high level and draw arrows on maps with dates and names of battles and loot figures and so on and so forth. And worse, that in this 30,000 foot telling of the story, instead of having a full picture of who these people are and what drives their behavior in our minds, we will all instead end up subconsciously drawing upon the ridiculously simplified barbarian tropes that are force-fed to history enthusiasts in the slop that is produced on this topic by Netflix and Amazon and others. And so in order to do this podcast the right way, we need to take a step back and explore Alcuin's question of why the Viking Age happened. And in doing so, transform this story from one told from 30,000 feet, the big arrows on maps version, to a human story that we can get close to, that we can see and that we can smell, and that we can understand to the degree that we can try and see the world through their eyes. Not out of glorification of the violence and devastation that we'll later get into, but rather to massively amplify the richness of the story. Because, folks, history is the greatest story ever told. History is way more interesting than anything that gets big on TV these days. TV being a pale shadow of the level of violence and intrigue and bravery and beauty and horror held within the story that is the history of our species. And by understanding who the Vikings are and where they came from, but most importantly, why they did what they did, we unlock the richness to that story. By stepping back and understanding these things, for example, the Lindisfarne Raid goes beyond just being a simple act of piracy, but also a desperate jab thrown out by a beleaguered pagan people that was on its heels and felt itself under siege by wars of Christian expansion. And it also becomes an outgrowth of Scandinavian domestic politics. And for the Vikings that did it, it wasn't just a raid for riches, it was also an act with deep religious overtones, among a whole litany of other things. And so the first handful of episodes are going to step back and answer Alcuin's question by exploring who these people are and where they came from, and then build the world as it was on the eve of the Viking Age. And by taking this approach, we can ensure that when we dive into the raids and the conquests and the exploration and the colonization and trading activity that saw these people ranging from Canada to Baghdad, an area spanning 5,000 miles and 40 modern-day countries, that you will be able to fully appreciate this greatest of all stories. That you'll be able to visualize it in your mind in full color and walk in their shoes by virtue of understanding who these people are and why they did what they did, and what they saw when they looked out at the world, and how they conceptualized themselves and the universe around them. Because if there's one thing to know up front, it's that the Norse pagan world is weirder and more alien than you can possibly imagine. Before we conclude, I want to give you all an overview of what to expect from this podcast. And for those who have listened to Dan Carlin and his Hardcore History series, I plan on using a very similar approach. For those not familiar, that means that this is going to be a long-form history podcast, with episodes in the 2 to 3-ish hour range, a particular style of history podcast that Dan is the undisputed master of. And while this might seem intense, long-form episodes give us two huge advantages. First, they are super immersive because it enables us to properly tee up a topic and then fully dive into it, which is what we all really enjoy about Dan, don't we? Him taking our minds and hurling them down the proverbial rabbit hole. And second, it gives us the ability to see the big picture. Rather than trying to force everyone to piece together a coherent narrative after consuming a huge number of small 20-minute-sized bits one at a time. In my mind, that would be like trying to explain American civilization by doing 20-minute bits on things like barbecue and aircraft carriers and then the national highway system. Sure, you'll learn lots of nice little fun facts, but you won't really understand the cohesive story. And so the history will never become as truly alive in your mind as it could have been otherwise. So this means that this podcast will be unique in that you'll hopefully be able to listen to an easy Dan Carlin-like format, but with the depth that a focus on this singular topic allows for. Now, a few disclaimers. What you are going to get with this series is my take on the Viking Age. And so in the interest of transparency, my one-sentence background is that I studied history and Chinese language at the University of Georgia, then at Beijing Foreign Studies University in China, where I studied Mandarin in an immersion environment for a year before getting a graduate degree in something called strategic studies, which basically means everything from military history and foreign policy and international economics from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., after which I worked in a civilian intelligence capacity for the Office of Naval Intelligence for a few years before embarking on a career in consulting and corporate strategy and ops. So to be super clear, while I studied history for around 6 years, I am not a historian. And so my value add here comes primarily from two things. First, my lifelong fascination with the early medieval period, which gives me the focus needed to go through the literal mountain of books that I have here next to me. And second, that I have spent enough time in and around the proverbial ivory tower, but also outside of it in the real world, that I can, hopefully, serve as a bridge between the two, by making the history of the Viking Age entertaining to listen to and easy to understand at an in-depth level, even for folks that are new to medieval history. So with all that said, like we mentioned, the next 2 episodes are going to build a foundation for this podcast series by first exploring the spicy question of who the Scandinavians are and where they came from. And then after this, we'll dive into the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which is the event that sets the geopolitical chessboard in early medieval Northern Europe in which the Viking Age takes place. And then in episode 3, we'll get into Scandinavia proper, and we'll get into how the Scandinavians turn into a people that had the motivations and the capabilities to make something like the Viking Age happen. So that said, strap in. My name is Henry Holst, and welcome again to the Northway Podcast.